Copper coated her tongue hours before incoming mortars cratered Juliet Base. Harper never grabbed that heavy sniper rifle seeking medals. She claimed it because Wyatt lay dying near burning Humvees, and comms were completely severed. Survival rarely involves courage. Surviving just requires cold, unforgiving, ugly arithmetic. The morning had been suffocatingly ordinary. At Forward Operating Base Juliet, the heat didn't just rise, it settled. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the canvas tents, turning the air inside into a stagnant pool of sweat, hot nylon, and the sharp, chemical tang of gun oil. Harper sat on an overturned milk crate, a brass scraper in her right hand, digging baked-on carbon out of her M4's bolt carrier group. The grit was everywhere. It lived in her cuticles, ground between her molars every time she swallowed, and formed a coarse paste in the creases of her neck. She was a SEAL. She had survived the freezing surf of Coronado, the sleep deprivation, the endless hazing masked as selection. But nothing in BUDS really trained a person for the sheer, mind-numbing boredom of a static desert deployment. Across the cramped tent, Wyatt was cursing. He was fighting a losing battle with a knotted bootlace, his broad shoulders hunched over his knees. He didn't look like the recruitment posters. His beard was patchy, caked with yellow dust, and there were dark, bruised bags under his eyes. They had been married for 3 years, operating in the same theatre for the last 4 months. The Navy hadn't liked it, but when a unit is short on qualified operators, regulations suddenly become flexible. "Cut the damn thing," Harper said, her voice raspy. She didn't look up from the bolt carrier. "I cut it. I have 3 inches of lace left, Harp," Wyatt muttered, yanking at the nylon cord. "Supply hasn't brought in new boots since April. I'm not running a patrol in slip-ons." She grunted, wiping a smear of Hopper's No. 9 off her thumb onto her cargo pants. The solvent smelled sharp, cutting through the background stench of the base's burn pits, a noxious blend of incinerated plastic, diesel fuel, and human waste that drifted over the HESCO barriers every time the wind shifted. The first indication that the world was ending wasn't a siren. It was a change in the atmospheric pressure. Harper's ears popped. The heavy, stagnant air inside the tent suddenly sucked inward, followed a microsecond later by a sound that wasn't really a sound. It was a physical blow. The concussion wave hit her chest like a swinging cinder block. The tent vanished. 1 second there was canvas and aluminum poles, and the next there was only blinding white light and a roar that tore the breath from her lungs. Harper was thrown backward, the overturned milk crate shattering beneath her. She hit the packed dirt floor hard, her skull bouncing off the ground. For a long, indeterminate moment, there was nothing, just a high-pitched electronic squeal ringing inside her head, drowning out the universe. She blinked. Dust was falling like grey snow. The roof of the tent was gone, replaced by a sky choked with thick, oily black smoke. Harper tried to inhale, but her diaphragm spasmed. The air was thick with pulverized concrete, burning rubber, and the metallic, sulphurous reek of high explosives. She rolled onto her side, coughing violently. A string of thick saliva hung from her lip, speckled with dirt. Her hands scrambled blindly in the dirt, fingers seeking the familiar cold metal of her disassembled rifle. She found the lower receiver, but the bolt carrier group was gone, buried somewhere in the debris. Useless. "Wyatt!" She tried to shout, but it came out as a weak, raspy croak. She forced herself to her knees. Her equilibrium was shot. The ground felt like it was pitching on a heavy sea. Her left ear was bleeding, a warm trickle sliding down her neck, pooling against her collarbone. She looked toward where Wyatt had been sitting. The cot was shredded. He wasn't there. The high-pitched whine in her ears began to recede. replaced by a chaotic wall of noise. The staccato pop-pop-pop of small arms fire, the deeper rhythmic thud of a heavy machine gun opening up from the northern watchtower. Screaming, not the dramatic, defiant yells of action movies, but the high, panicked shrieks of people in profound pain. Harper dragged herself forward, her hands sinking into the powdery dust. She found her holster still strapped to her thigh and drew her Sig Sauer. 15 rounds against an overrun base. The absurdity of it made a harsh, ugly laugh bubble up in the back of her throat, tasting like copper and ash. She crawled over the torn canvas of their tent, keeping her profile low. The sunlight was filtered through the smoke, casting an eerie, jaundiced glow over the FOB. The motor pool, 50 yards away, was a twisted graveyard of burning Humvees. Figures were moving through the smoke. Some wore the digitized camo of her unit. Others didn't. They were wearing civilian clothes, tactical vests over dish dashes, pouring through a massive, jagged hole blown in the eastern HESCO perimeter. They weren't moving with military precision. They were swarming, desperate and fast, firing off the hip, spraying rounds wildly into the compound. Harper watched a young comms tech. Barely 20, she couldn't remember his name, just that he had a stupid mustache, run out from the Tactical Operations Center. He didn't even have his weapon raised before 3 rounds caught him in the chest. He dropped like a sack of wet cement, hitting the dirt with a heavy, unceremonious thud. No slow motion, no final words. Just there, and then gone. Her stomach rolled. She swallowed back a surge of bile, the acidic burn searing her throat. The training kicked in, cold and mechanical, shoving the panic into a tiny, locked box in the back of her mind. Assess, move, survive. She needed a long gun, and she needed to find Wyatt. She hugged the edge of a concrete blast wall, the rough cinder blocks scraping the skin off her knuckles as she moved toward the northern sector. A stray round cracked against the concrete inches from her face, spalling a shower of razor-sharp stone shards into her cheek. She didn't flinch. She just kept moving, her breath hissing out in short, ragged bursts, her eyes locked on the skeletal frame of the sniper tower looming ahead. The wooden stairs leading up to the watchtower were slick with a sticky, dark substance. Harper didn't look down to confirm what it was. Her boots slipped, her knee banging painfully against a wooden strut. But she dragged herself upward, her lungs burning, the Sig Sauer held tight to her chest. She crested the trap door at the top of the tower and shoved it open. The space was no larger than a walk-in closet, lined with sandbags that were bleeding dirt from a dozen bullet holes. Miller, the platoon's designated marksman, was slumped in the corner. He was a kid from Ohio who always smelled faintly of chewing tobacco and peppermint. Half of his neck was missing. The flies had already found him, a shiny, buzzing swarm clustering around the jagged, wet edge of the wound. The smell of voided bowels and hot blood was overpowering in the enclosed space. Harper felt a sudden, fierce spike of anger. It wasn't righteous fury. It was a petty, bitter annoyance that Miller had died and left her to deal with this mess. She hated being up high. She hated the exposure. She holstered her pistol and reached for the weapon resting on the sandbags. It was a Macmillan TAC 338 sniper rifle. It was obscenely heavy, nearly 15 pounds of steel and polymer. It felt entirely different from the compact, versatile M4 she was used to. This wasn't a weapon for a gunfight. It was an instrument for cold, calculated execution. She hauled the heavy rifle up, the barrel scraping loudly against the canvas of the sandbags. Her hands were shaking. Tremors racked her forearms, her body dumping adrenaline faster than her system could process it. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing a deep, expanding breath into her belly. Holding it, letting it out slowly. The tremors didn't stop, but they slowed to a manageable vibration. She pressed her cheek against the stock. It was blisteringly hot from sitting in the sun, burning the sensitive skin over her cheekbone. She ignored it, pressing her eye to the Schmidt and Bender scope. The glass was coated in a fine layer of dust. She swore, pulling back to wipe the lens with the dirty heel of her palm, smearing the grit but clearing the center of the reticle. She dropped back onto the gun. Through the optic, the chaotic, noisy hellscape of the FOB was suddenly reduced to a silent, magnified, two-dimensional circle. It was a bizarre detachment. Through the glass, the men killing her friends didn't look like monsters. They just looked like thermal heat signatures and wrinkled clothing. She swept the crosshairs past the burning TOC, past the shattered remains of the mess hall, tracking toward the motor pool. The smoke was thick, but the wind was tearing ragged holes in the black clouds. "Come on, Cole. Come on, Wyatt. Where are you?" Her finger rested lightly on the trigger guard. The metal was smooth, worn bare at the edges from Miller's constant handling. Then she saw him. Wyatt was pinned behind the burned-out chassis of an MRAP, about 200 yards out. He was sitting awkwardly, his back against the blackened tire. His right pant leg was dark and soaked, clinging wetly to his calf. He had his rifle up, firing short, controlled bursts around the edge of the tire. But he was trapped. 3 insurgents had flanked him, using a stack of shipping containers for cover. They were taking their time, moving up, preparing to end him. Harper's chest tightened, a cold vice clamping down on her heart. She didn't feel a surge of heroic love. She felt a sickening, hollow terror that threatened to make her vomit right there on the wooden floorboards. If he died, she was alone in this dust bowl. Wind. She glanced away from the scope, her eyes darting to the flags, to the smoke. Wind was coming from the left, about 10 knots. Distance, roughly 220 yards. With the .338 Lapua Magnum round, at this distance, the drop was negligible, but the wind would push it slightly. She racked the massive bolt back. It was a heavy, mechanical clunk, far louder than the slick action of an assault rifle. A brass casing ejected, spinning through the air and landing on the floorboards with a hollow ping. She pushed the bolt forward, chambering a fresh, massive round, and locked it down. She settled her crosshairs on the closest insurgent. He was stepping out from behind the shipping container, raising an RPG launcher, aiming it directly at Wyatt's position. Harper didn't hold her breath. That was a myth. You shoot at the natural respiratory pause. She exhaled slowly, feeling her chest deflate, the crosshairs steadying just under the man's sternum. Squeeze, don't pull. The rifle fired. The recoil was brutal. Even with the muzzle brake, the heavy weapon kicked back like a startled mule, slamming the buttstock into her shoulder pocket so hard she felt the joint pop. The concussive blast in the small, enclosed tower was deafening, a physical shockwave that shook the dust from the corrugated tin roof. Hot gas blew back into her face, smelling of ammonia and burnt sulfur. Through the scope, the result was instantaneous and grotesque. The .338 round didn't just pierce the man, it disassembled him. The sheer kinetic energy tore through his chest cavity, flipping him backward into the dirt like a broken toy. The RPG tube clattered uselessly onto the gravel. Harper didn't pause to admire the shot. Muscle memory, drilled into her through thousands of hours of agonizing repetition, took over. Her right hand flew off the grip, slapping the bolt handle up and back. The empty casing flew out, searing hot. It struck her bare forearm, burning the skin instantly. She gritted her teeth against the sting, slamming the bolt forward, chambering the next round. She found the second target. He was turning, confused by the sudden detonation of his comrade. His mouth was open in a yell she couldn't hear. The crosshairs settled on his center mass. She exhaled, paused, fired. The kick, the roar, the smell of powder. The man folded in half, dropping straight down into the dust. 2 down, 1 left near the containers. Harper racked the bolt again, her shoulder throbbing with a dull, heavy ache. Her eye was watering heavily, the cordite stinging her tear ducts. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision. The scope was slightly misaligned from the recoil, and she had to muscle the heavy barrel back into position. The third man had figured out where the fire was coming from. He wasn't looking at Wyatt anymore. He was staring directly up at the northern watchtower. Through the magnified glass, Harper could see his eyes. They were wide, heavily lined with dust and sweat. For a fraction of a second, across 2 football fields of burning wreckage, they were looking right at each other. He raised his AK-47. Harper's finger tightened on the trigger. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The cold mechanical math had completely taken over. Elevation, windage, breath. The world narrowed to the space between her eye and the glass. The insurgent's AK-47 cycled first. Harper didn't hear the crack of the rifle over the ambient roar of the dying base, but she heard the rounds hit. The wooden slats of the watchtower shattered, violently splintering a foot below the sill. Jagged shards of treated pine exploded inward, raining across her forearms and the back of her neck. A stray 7.62mm round slammed into the sandbag inches from her cheek, tearing the canvas. Hot, coarse sand sprayed directly into her eyes, blinding her right eye instantly. She flinched, pulling the heavy trigger of the TC-338 as she squeezed her eyes shut. It was a bad shot, a panicked, sympathetic reflex. The massive rifle bucked, the recoil driving the unforgiving buttstock directly into her collarbone instead of the meaty pocket of her shoulder. A sharp, localized pain snapped across her chest, radiating down her bicep. The heavy .338 round went wide, blowing a melon-sized chunk out of the concrete blast wall 20 feet behind the insurgent. She gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her right eye, rubbing furiously at the grit. It was a stupid, amateur mistake. Rubbing only ground the sand deeper into the sclera. Her eye watered profusely, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheek. Breathe, cycle the bolt, work the problem. She forced her hand away from her face, blinking rapidly through the tearing, and slapped the bolt handle up. The action was stiff. The rifle was fouled with dirt, the heavy brass casing resisting extraction. She hit the bolt handle with the heel of her palm, forcing it back. The spent casing ejected, spinning away. She shoved the bolt forward, stripping the next round from the magazine, and locked it down. Through her left eye, her non-dominant eye, the scope was a blurry, unmanageable mess. She shifted her head, pressing her weeping right eye back to the glass, fighting the burning sensation. The man with the AK wasn't there. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her gut. She swept the crosshairs frantically left, then right. Dust, smoke. The burning skeleton of a water truck. No target. A heavy, rhythmic thudding started to echo across the compound. It was slower than the frantic chatter of the AKs, but infinitely louder. Thump, 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 thump. A white Toyota Hilux had breached the shattered perimeter, rolling over the crushed, wire mesh remains of the HESCO barriers. Mounted in the truck bed was a DSHK heavy machine gun. The weapon was a beast, firing 12.7mm armor-piercing rounds designed to chew through light armored vehicles. The gunner was blind firing, sweeping the heavy barrel across the FOB. The rounds found the TOC first. The cinderblock walls of the command center didn't just absorb the hits, they disintegrated. Then the gunner saw the watchtower. Harper realized what was happening exactly half a second before the first round hit. She abandoned the Macmillan. She didn't carefully stow it or sling it. She just let go, diving backward off the sandbag wall, pressing herself flat against the wooden floorboards, burying her face in the crook of her elbow. The watchtower was systematically disassembled around her. The DSHK rounds tore through the sandbags like wet paper. The noise was absolute, a deafening, percussive pounding that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled Harper's teeth in her skull. Wood splintered. Sand rained down in thick, suffocating sheets. Miller's lifeless body, slumped in the corner, absorbed several impacts, jerking violently like a morbid marionette. Harper covered her ears, screaming in pure, involuntary terror. She wasn't an operator right then. She was just a squishy, fragile bag of meat trapped in a wooden box, while steel tore the air apart. The smell of pine resin, pulverized concrete, and Miller's fresh blood created a sickening, coppery perfume that clung to the back of her throat. The firing stopped. The truck was likely repositioning, or the gunner was feeding a new belt. Harper didn't wait to find out. She scrambled backward, her hands slipping in the slick puddle of Miller's blood. She found the open trapdoor and threw herself down the wooden stairs. She didn't run, she slid, tumbling the last few steps and hitting the packed dirt at the base of the tower with a heavy, breathless grunt. Her lungs were burning. Her right eye was swelling shut, the sand still scraping agonizingly against her cornea. She drew her Sig Sauer again, checking the chamber with a quick, dirty press check. She had left the heavy rifle. She had no body armor, no radio, and a pistol with 14 rounds against an overwhelming force. She looked toward the motor pool. The smoke had thickened, a greasy black pall settling over the vehicles. She couldn't see the MRAP. She couldn't see Wyatt. "Screw it!" she hissed, spitting a mouthful of gritty saliva into the dirt. She broke cover, sprinting into the smoke. The heat of the open ground was oppressive. The soles of her boots felt like they were melting against the baked earth. Harper kept low, using the burning husk of a troop transport as concealment. The air here was unbreathable, thick with the chemical stench of melting tires and burning diesel. She moved in short, jagged bursts. Cover to cover, check the corners. It was the rudimentary geometry of urban combat, but out here, stripped of her team and her kit, it felt desperately improvised. She rounded the charred rear axle of a Humvee and slammed directly into a man. It wasn't cinematic. There was no sudden martial arts reflex. It was a clumsy, brutal collision of bone and gear. He was young, maybe 19, wearing a faded blue polo shirt under a heavy chest rig. He smelled intensely of old sweat and cheap, sweet tobacco. The impact knocked the breath out of both of them. His rifle, a rusted FAL, was slung across his back. He had been carrying an ammo tin in both hands. The tin hit the dirt, spilling brass casings everywhere. Harper reacted faster, driven by the pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct to not die in the dirt. She brought the Sig up, but he lunged, his dirty, calloused hands closing around her wrist, twisting hard. A sharp spike of pain shot up her forearm. Her finger jerked the trigger. The 9mm round went harmlessly into the sky. He was stronger than he looked, driving his shoulder into her chest, throwing her backward into the rusted side panel of the Humvee. Her head cracked against the metal, her vision whiting out for a terrifying fraction of a second. He let go of her wrist and scrambled for the knife sheathed on his rig. Harper didn't try to wrestle him. She didn't try to be clean. She dropped her weight, brought her left knee up in a vicious, uncoordinated strike, and buried it into his groin. The man grunted, a wet, breathy sound, and his grip faltered. Harper yanked her gun arm free, jammed the muzzle of the cig directly into the soft flesh under his jaw, and pulled the trigger twice. The noise was deafening that close. The man's head snapped back, a spray of warm, wet mist coating Harper's face and neck. He collapsed instantly, a dead weight pulling her down with him. She violently shoved him off, scrambling backward like a crab, her breath coming in ragged, ugly sobs. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, smearing the blood and soot into a terrifying mask. She didn't look at him. She just pushed herself up and kept moving toward the MRAP. The gunfire was shifting away from the motor pool, concentrating near the main gate. The QRF, Quick Reaction Force, from the neighboring base must be inbound. She could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of a 10 warthogs cutting through the atmosphere far above the smoke. She rounded the massive armored tires of the MRAP and found him. Wyatt was exactly where she had seen him through the scope, but he was no longer sitting up. He was slumped sideways, his cheek pressed into the dirt. His rifle was empty, the bolt locked back, lying uselessly by his good leg. Harper dropped to her knees, her pistol skittering away into the dust. Wyatt, she grabbed his shoulder, rolling him onto his back. His face was grey, the skin clammy and completely devoid of colour. His lips were a pale, bruised purple. "Hey!" she choked out, her voice cracking. She slapped his cheek, leaving a smear of the insurgent's blood across his pale skin. "Hey, look at me." His eyelids fluttered. They were sluggish, uncoordinated. His pupils were blown wide. "Harp," he slurred. His voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. You're really dirty." "Shut up," she snapped, but it came out as a broken whisper. She looked down at his leg. The fabric of his pants was completely saturated, turning the tan nylon into a dark, heavy maroon. She reached down, her fingers desperately seeking the source of the bleed. The bullet had entered just above the knee, shattering the femur and tearing through the femoral artery. The blood wasn't pulsing anymore. It was just seeping out in a thick, lethargic puddle. That was worse. It meant there wasn't much pressure left in the system. "Tourniquet," she muttered, frantically patting down his rig. "Where's your damn TQ?" "Used it," he whispered, his head lolling to the side. On coal. Back there." Harper swore violently. A long, unbroken string of profanity that tasted like ash. She ripped at the Velcro of her own cargo pocket, her trembling fingers failing twice before she managed to pull out her cat tourniquet. She looped the nylon band high and tight, practically in his groin, threading the strap through the buckle. Her hands were slick with his blood, making it nearly impossible to grip the windlass rod. "This is going to suck," she said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, mechanical detachment she needed to function. She twisted the plastic rod. One turn, two. Wyatt arched his back off the dirt, a ragged, guttural scream tearing from his throat. His hands flew up, grabbing her wrists, trying to stop the excruciating pain of the crushed tissue. "Stop it! Let me work!" she yelled, ignoring his grip, using her body weight to force the rod around a third time. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. She locked the windlass into the plastic clip and secured the Velcro strap over it. She collapsed back onto her heels, her chest heaving. The adrenaline was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Every muscle in her body ached. Her shoulder throbbed, her eye burned, and the side of her head pounded in a sickening rhythm. She looked down at Wyatt. He had passed out from the pain of the tourniquet, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. He looked small, stripped of the swagger, the tactical gear, and the jokes. He was just a broken, bleeding man in the dirt. Harper didn't feel relief. She didn't feel a triumphant surge of survival. The base was still burning. The air was still choked with the toxic soot of incinerated plastic. The high, screaming roar of the A-10s finally broke over the base, shaking the ground, unleashing a torrent of 30mm depleted uranium rounds on the perimeter. The cavalry had arrived. Too late for Miller. Too late for the kid with the mustache. She reached out, wiping a streak of dirt from Wyatt's forehead with her thumb. The blood on her hands was already turning tacky, drying into a stiff, rust-colored paste in the baking heat. She didn't kiss him. She didn't cry. She just picked up her empty pistol, checked the open chamber with numb, filthy fingers, and sat back against the heavy tire of the MRAP, waiting for the smoke to clear. If this grounded, gritty look into the chaos of modern combat kept you on the edge of your seat, you know exactly what to do next. War isn't fought by invincible heroes. It's fought by real, flawed people making desperate choices in the dirt. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who appreciates raw, tactical storytelling. Drop a comment below. What was the most intense moment for you? See you in the next one.